Hey, welcome back to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans, for Ohio State fans. From the West Coast, I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Sunday, October 20th, and thank you for joining me while I talk to myself about some pretty interesting results from yesterday's college football slate. As you know, the Buckeyes were off yesterday, but that doesn't mean there isn't still a lot to talk about from the world of major college football. And I want to spend a few minutes with you today talking about a handful of the more notable results from yesterday's action through an Ohio State lens. So let's jump right into it. First, I think it's time to have a serious discussion about the Indiana Hoosiers, folks. The 16th ranked undefeated Hoosiers blew the doors off of Nebraska yesterday afternoon in Bloomington, 56-7. Now, I watched most of this game. The Hoosiers finished with 495 total yards of offense. The Indiana ground game finished with 215 yards at 6.5 yards per carry and 5 rushing touchdowns. The Hoosier defense forced Nebraska quarterback Dylan Raiola into 3 interceptions. They forced 5 total turnovers. They held the Nebraska ground game to 2.4 yards per carry. If you've not been paying attention to what's happening in Bloomington, let me catch you up. First-year head coach Curt Cignetti replaced Tom Allen during the offseason. Cignetti came from James Madison University, where he went 52-9 over 5 seasons. He posted an 11-1 record at JMU last year, and he was named the Sun Belt Coach of the Year. Now, Cignetti has spent most of his 41-year career as an assistant, including 3 seasons under Nick Saban in Alabama. At the age of 63, he's only just now getting his first shot at being a head coach in a major conference. Now, Cignetti is a brash, confident dude. Shortly after he was hired in December, he addressed the crowd at an IU basketball game and said, quote, "I don't take a backseat to anybody, and I don't plan on starting now. Purdue sucks, and so does Michigan and Ohio State," end quote. Now, Cignetti completely reshaped the Indiana roster during the offseason with 31 incoming transfers, including 13 players that he brought with him from JMU. Now, those players include JMU's 2 leading rushers, Tyson Lawton and Kalon Black, who are currently Indiana's 2nd and 3rd leading rushers. Their leading receiver, Elijah Surratt, who is now IU's leading receiver. Surratt has 578 yards receiving at 18.1 yards per reception. Now, for a little context, that's more receiving yards and a better per reception average than both Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka. Cignetti also brought JMU's 2 leading tacklers with him from JMU, linebackers Aiden Fisher and Jalen Walker. Guess what? Fisher and Walker are now Indiana's 2 leading tacklers. They've combined for 106 tackles so far this season. Fisher right now is the Big Ten's 4th leading tackler with 66. And again, for a little reference, Ohio State's 2 leading tacklers, Sonny Styles and Lathan Ransom, have a combined 67 tackles. Cignetti also brought JMU's 2 best defensive linemen with him to Indiana, Mikhail Kamara and James Carpenter. And right now, Kamara leads the Big Ten in sacks with 6, and he has a staggering 31 pressures. He has twice as many sacks as JT Tuimoloau, and he has 10 more pressures than Jack Sawyer. Again, just for reference. But I think the most valuable transfer Cignetti added during the offseason was Ohio University quarterback Curtis Rourke. And Rourke has been a revelation in Bloomington. He's currently 4th in the Big Ten in passing, and he's 2nd only to Dylan Gabriel in completion percentage at 74.6%. He's thrown 15 touchdowns to only 3 INTs. Now, Rourke had to lead the game against Nebraska yesterday with what looked like a thumb injury. He did not return. And it's since been reported that he's going to miss next week's game against Washington. So that's a situation worth monitoring. But look, folks, Indiana is 7-0, and they have yet to trail in a football game this season. I'm going to say that again. They have yet to trail in a football game this season. It's time to sit up and take notice of Curt Cignetti and the Indiana Hoosiers, folks. They are for real, and there is a very realistic chance they're undefeated and ranked in the top 10 when the Buckeyes play them in the Horseshoe on November 23rd. And Ohio State better not be looking ahead to Michigan that day, or they could find themselves in real trouble. Now, speaking of Michigan, The the tailspin continues, and it is glorious. The Wolverines were 21-7 losers at Illinois yesterday. Now, I watched most of this game as well. Only 322 total yards for the Michigan offense and 3 yards per carry in the run game. Michigan turned the ball over 3 more times in this game. Right now, Michigan is 117th nationally in turnover margin, and the Michigan offense has 15 total turnovers so far this year. That's tied for 122nd nationally. Only 4 teams in the FBS, Auburn, Temple, East Carolina, and South Mississippi, have turned it over more than Michigan. Sherrone Moore is on his third quarterback, Jack Tuttle, the 6-year senior who spent most of his career at Indiana. Now, Tuttle's claim to fame is that he was Chris Olave's high school teammate. Now, Tuttle was responsible for 2 of Michigan's 3 turnovers against Illinois with an INT and a fumble. He had a second interception that was waved off by an Illinois penalty. He was awful yesterday. Look, if I'm a Michigan fan, I'm wondering how the hell Curtis Rourke ended up at Indiana and not at Michigan. I mean, Rourke would have been the perfect bridge quarterback at Michigan, but instead, he's winning big and putting up huge numbers in Bloomington. So good for you, IU. I also want to issue a quick mea culpa as USC blows a 14-point fourth quarter lead and loses to lowly Maryland in College Park yesterday. This was a Maryland squad coming off a 27-point loss to Northwestern. Their last win was a month ago against Villanova. Now, if you're a regular listener of this podcast, then you know I foolishly picked USC to make it to the Big Ten title game after Oregon's early struggles. And in the same breath, I wondered aloud if Nebraska might be the best team left on Ohio State's schedule. Not one of my better moments. Now, after playing one of the more entertaining games earlier this season at Michigan, the Trojans have joined the Wolverines in a spectacular tailspin of their own. And you have to wonder, does Lincoln Riley make it out of this season with his job? I think that's a big question. I wonder how much Riley's buyout is. Most USC fans must be wondering the same thing. If you check our feed on X, I posted a short video from Matt Leinart, a very despondent Matt Leinart talking about the situation at USC. It is not good for the Trojans in their first year in the Big Ten. Oh, finally, in the main event last night, Georgia reminded everyone that the path to the SEC title still goes through Athens. The Bulldogs eviscerated Texas in Austin 30-15. Now, this game was not a Mona Lisa on offense for either team, especially at quarterback. The quarterbacks in this game were responsible for 7 turnovers. Carson Beck threw 3 picks. Quinn Ewers had a pick and 2 fumbles, only 175 yards passing for Beck. He did not throw a touchdown, and it got so bad for Ewers that at one point he was replaced by Arch Manning, who wasn't much better. Manning was only 3 of 6 for 19 yards passing and a fumble. The Georgia defensive front looked utterly terrifying last night. 28 quarterback pressures, 7 sacks, and 10 tackles for loss. Jalen Walker led the Georgia defense with 3 sacks. But if you're comparing this game to last Saturday's main event, Ohio State-Oregon, man, it was an eyesore. And you could argue that Ohio State and Oregon played a much cleaner, much more fluid game than Texas and Georgia yesterday. And Dylan Gabriel and Will Howard looked like fucking Tom Brady and Joe Montana compared to Beck and Ewers last night. My big takeaway from this game is I would personally be very worried about the matchup with the Georgia defense and Jalen Walker. You know, if Ohio State were to face them in the playoff. I mean, just given the Josh Simmons injury and the struggles of the Ohio State offensive line, that would be a very big concern for me should Ohio State see them in the playoff. But look, Carson Beck has been a turnover machine this season. Beck has thrown 5 picks in his last 2 games. He had 3 more in Georgia's loss to Alabama back on September 28th. And I think if you're an Ohio State fan or an Oregon fan watching that game last night, I think you have to like your chances against either team. Now, the Ducks will almost certainly be your new number 1 in the AP and coaches polls this week. I expect Georgia and Penn State to be ranked ahead of Ohio State, and it's probably a discussion of whether Georgia, with 1 loss, but with a road win over last week's number 1, did enough to leapfrog an undefeated Penn State. I tend to think maybe they did. And I expect Ohio State to stay at number 4. We are very likely looking at a top 4 matchup between Ohio State and Penn State on November 2nd, but I think Penn State has a bit of a tricky game at Wisconsin next Saturday. The Badgers have been playing much better lately. They've won their last 3, and we know Madison is always a very tough place to play, no matter how good Wisconsin is. Now, the early line on that game is Penn State minus 7.5. We'll see if that line comes down. I would not be surprised if it did. And the Buckeyes, as we know, are back in action next Saturday in the Horseshoe against Nebraska. The Cornhuskers will be licking their wounds from that humiliating 56-7 defeat to Indiana. They come into this game with the Buckeyes at 5-2. Nebraska quarterback Dylan Raiola, he appears to have hit a freshman wall. If you look at his performance over the last 3 games, Raiola only has 1 touchdown pass to 4 interceptions. He's been sacked 7 times, and he's not getting much help from his running game. The Huskers are currently 99th nationally in rushing offense and tied for 96th nationally in yards per attempt. Now, the early line on this game is Ohio State minus 25.5, according to Vegas Insider. We'll see if there's any movement on that line. Now, I'm going to be watching the Buckeye offensive line in this game very closely and how they'll be managing the loss of Josh Simmons. That is a huge question for this team as they head into the second half of the season. Okay. That's going to do it for me, short and sweet. Check your feeds for a more detailed preview of the Nebraska game from Paige, Chad, and myself this coming Thursday. Until then, thanks so much for listening, and go Bucks. You've been listening to The South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. Follow us on X at South_Stands.